The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Buckingham Palace, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Thomas Hartwell had been walking these corridors for 23 years, his polished boots creating a rhythmic echo that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. As the senior royal guard responsible for the crown jewels collection, he carried himself with the dignified bearing that his position demanded. Today felt different. The weight of recent changes hung heavy in the air, and Thomas could sense it in every corner of the palace. The staff moved with a particular carefulness, their voices lowered to respectful whispers. Queen Elizabeth had passed away just 3 months ago, and the transition period had been both swift and overwhelming for everyone involved. Thomas paused outside the Queen's private study, now being prepared for its new occupant. Through the partially open door, he could see moving boxes and staff members carefully wrapping personal items. His chest tightened with an emotion he struggled to name. This room had been sacred ground for decades, filled with the late Queen's presence and wisdom. "Excuse me, Mr. Hartwell?" A young palace aide approached nervously. "Her Majesty, Queen Camilla, has requested to view the crown jewels collection this afternoon. She specifically mentioned wanting to see the pieces that were most cherished by the late Queen." Thomas nodded slowly, his weathered face showing no emotion. "Of course, I shall prepare the viewing room accordingly." His voice carried the steady tone of a man who had served the monarchy through countless transitions. Yet something about this particular request stirred unease within him. As the aide hurried away, Thomas remained standing in the corridor. His mind wandered to the countless hours he had spent with Queen Elizabeth, discussing the historical significance of each piece in the collection. She had possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every jewel, every crown, every ceremonial piece. More importantly, she had understood their emotional weight, their connection to centuries of British history. The late Queen had often told him that the jewels were not mere accessories but vessels of memory and tradition. "They carry the weight of our ancestors, Thomas," she had said during one of their regular inspections. "Each piece tells a story of duty, sacrifice, and service to the realm." Those words echoed in his mind now as he prepared for the afternoon appointment. Thomas made his way to the secure vault that housed the most precious items of the collection. The electronic locks responded to his clearance codes with soft beeps, and the heavy door swung open to reveal rows of carefully climate-controlled display cases. The sight never failed to take his breath away, even after all these years. The imperial state crown sat in its place of honor, its 2,868 diamonds catching the specialized lighting and throwing tiny rainbows across the walls. Beside it, the sovereign's orb gleamed with quiet magnificence, while Edward's crown waited in solemn dignity. Each piece represented not just monetary value but the unbroken chain of British monarchy stretching back through the centuries. Thomas began his careful inspection routine, checking each item against the detailed inventory list. His trained eye noted every detail, every security seal, every environmental reading. This collection was his responsibility, his sacred trust, and he took that duty with utmost seriousness. As he worked, his thoughts returned to Queen Camilla's upcoming visit. He had served the royal family through many changes over the years, but this transition felt particularly significant. The late Queen had been a constant presence for over 70 years. Her deep connection to these treasures evident in every interaction Thomas had witnessed. He remembered the day Queen Elizabeth had shown him her grandmother Queen Mary's emerald choker. Her eyes had grown soft as she recounted the story behind it, how it had been worn during state dinners throughout 2 world wars. "These pieces ground us, Thomas," she had explained. "They remind us that we are custodians, not owners. We hold them in trust for future generations." The afternoon approached more quickly than Thomas had expected. He positioned himself at the entrance to the viewing room, his uniform immaculate, his posture perfect. Years of protocol had trained him to maintain professional composure regardless of his personal feelings, but today he found himself struggling with an unusual internal conflict. When Queen Camilla arrived, she was accompanied by her personal secretary and 2 ladies-in-waiting. Thomas bowed respectfully as she entered the room, his movements precise and practiced. She acknowledged him with a gracious nod, her manner warm but appropriately regal. "Mr. Hartwell, isn't it?" she asked, her voice carrying genuine interest. "I've heard wonderful things about your service to the crown. 23 years, I'm told?" "Yes, Your Majesty. It has been my honor to serve." Thomas's response was correct and professional, though he noticed a slight tremor in his own voice that surprised him. Queen Camilla moved toward the display cases with obvious curiosity, her eyes widening as she took in the magnificent collection. "These are even more extraordinary than I imagined," she murmured, approaching the imperial state crown. "The photographs never capture their true brilliance." Thomas watched her reaction carefully, noting the genuine appreciation in her expression. Yet something about her manner troubled him. There was admiration, certainly, but he sensed a different quality in her interest than what he had been accustomed to with Queen Elizabeth. Where the late Queen had approached these treasures with reverence born of deep historical knowledge, Queen Camilla seemed drawn more to their immediate beauty and splendor. "This sapphire is magnificent," Queen Camilla commented, studying St. Edward's sapphire in the imperial state crown. "I can see why it's considered one of the finest examples in existence." "Indeed, Your Majesty," Thomas replied carefully. "That particular stone has a remarkable provenance. It was said to have been worn in a ring by Edward the Confessor and was placed in the crown of St. Edward. Queen Elizabeth was particularly fond of its connection to English history spanning nearly 1,000 years. Queen Camilla nodded absently, her attention already moving to the next display case. "And this tiara? The workmanship is exquisite. The diamond diadem, Your Majesty. Created for the coronation of King George IV in 1821. It contains 1,333 brilliant cut diamonds and features roses, thistles, and shamrocks, representing England, Scotland, and Ireland." Thomas's voice carried the weight of practiced knowledge, but he found himself missing the engaged dialogue he had shared with the previous monarch. As the viewing continued, Thomas observed Queen Camilla's interactions with increasing concern. While she showed appropriate appreciation for the beauty and craftsmanship of the pieces, he sensed a lack of the deep emotional connection that he believed these treasures deserved. Her questions focused primarily on aesthetic details rather than historical significance or symbolic meaning. The moment that crystallized his unease came when Queen Camilla paused before Queen Mary's fringe tiara, the delicate piece that had been worn by Queen Elizabeth on her wedding day in 1947. The late Queen had always spoken of this tiara with particular tenderness, describing how it had made her feel connected to the long line of royal brides who had come before her. "This would be lovely for state dinners," Queen Camilla remarked casually, studying the intricate diamond pattern. "The design would complement formal evening wear beautifully." Thomas felt a sharp pang of dismay at her comment. To hear this historically significant piece, so beloved by Queen Elizabeth, discussed primarily in terms of fashion coordination, struck him as profoundly inappropriate. His hands clenched almost imperceptibly behind his back as he struggled to maintain his professional demeanor. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, his voice measured. "If I may share some context about that particular piece, Queen Elizabeth considered it one of the most meaningful items in the collection. She wore it on her wedding day, as did her daughter Princess Anne. The Queen often spoke of how it connected her to Queen Mary's legacy and the continuity of royal tradition." Queen Camilla looked up from the display case, her expression showing polite interest. "How fascinating. Yes, I can appreciate the sentimental value." But Thomas detected a certain dismissiveness in her tone that made his chest tighten with protective concern. The viewing continued for another hour, with Queen Camilla examining various pieces and making comments that increasingly troubled Thomas. While never openly disrespectful, her approach seemed to treat these precious artifacts more as luxury accessories than as sacred symbols of British heritage and continuity. When she expressed particular interest in wearing certain pieces for upcoming state functions, Thomas found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to gently remind her of established protocols. "Your Majesty, the scheduling and selection of ceremonial jewelry follows specific traditions and requires coordination with the Lord Chamberlain's office," he explained diplomatically. "Of course," Queen Camilla replied, though Thomas sensed a slight irritation in her voice. "I simply wanted to understand what options might be available. These pieces are meant to be worn and seen, after all, not hidden away." That comment struck Thomas like a physical blow. The late Queen had worn the crown jewels with the weight of history and responsibility, understanding that she was temporarily embodying centuries of tradition. Queen Elizabeth had never viewed wearing these pieces as a personal privilege but as a sacred duty performed in service to the nation. As the viewing session concluded, Thomas escorted Queen Camilla and her entourage back to the entrance of the viewing room. She thanked him graciously for his time and expertise, but he remained troubled by the entire encounter. Standing alone in the room after their departure, surrounded by the glittering treasures that had been his life's work to protect. Thomas felt a profound sense of unease about the future. The late queen had entrusted him with more than mere physical security of these artifacts. She had shared with him the deeper responsibility of preserving their meaning, their significance, their role as tangible links to British history and identity. Now, faced with a new monarch who seemed to view them primarily as beautiful objects rather than sacred symbols, Thomas wondered how he could fulfill that deeper trust. That evening, as Thomas completed his final security rounds, he found himself pausing longer than usual before each display case. The jewels seemed to gleam with particular intensity under the night lighting, as if they too sensed the uncertain times ahead. He thought of Queen Elizabeth's words about being custodians rather than owners, and felt the full weight of his responsibility settling heavily upon his shoulders. The challenge ahead was clear, though the path forward remained murky. Thomas knew he would need to find a way to educate Queen Camilla about the true significance of these treasures, to help her understand that they represented far more than royal privilege or aesthetic beauty. The question that haunted him as he locked the vault for the night was whether she would be receptive to such guidance, or whether his concerns would be dismissed as the outdated anxieties of an aging guardian. In the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace, with only the soft hum of security systems and his own footsteps for company, Thomas Hartwell began to plan his approach. The crown jewels had survived world wars, political upheavals, and social transformations. They would survive this transition too, but only if someone stood ready to defend not just their physical safety, but their spiritual significance. As the senior royal guard responsible for their protection, Thomas understood that this responsibility now rested squarely upon his shoulders. 3 weeks had passed since Queen Camilla's initial viewing of the crown jewels, and Thomas Hartwell's concerns had only deepened. Word had reached him through the palace's intricate network of staff communications that Her Majesty had been making inquiries about modifying certain pieces for contemporary occasions. The very thought made Thomas's stomach clench with anxiety. On this particular morning, Thomas arrived at his office to find a formal memorandum waiting on his desk. The royal seal at the top commanded immediate attention, and as he read the contents, his worst fears began to materialize. Queen Camilla had requested that several historically significant pieces be made available for a series of upcoming state functions, including some that had rarely been worn outside of the most solemn ceremonial occasions. Among the requested items was Queen Alexandra's kokoshnik tiara, a magnificent piece that had belonged to the Queen Mother and had been worn by Queen Elizabeth only on the most significant state occasions. The memorandum also mentioned Queen Mary's diamond bandeau, which held particular sentimental value as it had been worn by Meghan Markle at her wedding to Prince Harry. But more importantly, it had been a favorite of Queen Elizabeth's grandmother. Thomas set the memorandum down with trembling hands. These pieces weren't simply valuable jewelry. They were irreplaceable artifacts that connected the current monarchy to its historical foundations. The casual manner in which they were being requested suggested a fundamental misunderstanding of their significance. His telephone rang, interrupting his troubled thoughts. The caller was Margaret Thornfield, the assistant private secretary to Queen Camilla, her voice brisk and efficient. Mr. Hartwell, Her Majesty, would like to schedule fittings for the pieces mentioned in this morning's memorandum. We're looking at next Tuesday for the initial session. I see, Thomas replied carefully. Might I inquire about the specific occasions for which these pieces are intended? The protocol requirements vary considerably, depending on the nature of the event. There was a brief pause before Margaret responded. Her Majesty wishes to incorporate some of the collection's more spectacular pieces into her regular state function wardrobe. She feels it's important to showcase the crown's magnificent heritage more frequently. Thomas felt his professional composure wavering. Miss Thornfield, with respect, some of these pieces have very specific ceremonial significance. They aren't typically worn for general state functions. Queen Elizabeth reserved them for occasions of the highest importance. Times change, Mr. Hartwell, Margaret replied, her tone suggesting the conversation was concluded. Her Majesty has different perspectives on how best to honor the crown's heritage. The appointments will be confirmed for Tuesday afternoon. After the call ended, Thomas sat in his office staring out the window at the palace gardens where Queen Elizabeth had often walked during their informal discussions about the collection. He remembered her explaining how each piece had earned its place in royal tradition through specific historical moments and royal precedent. She had been a living repository of institutional memory, Understanding intuitively which pieces were appropriate for which occasions, the situation was becoming more complicated than Thomas had anticipated. He realized that his concerns went beyond simple protocol violations. Queen Camilla's approach seemed to reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between the monarchy and these sacred objects. Where Queen Elizabeth had seen herself as a temporary custodian, serving a greater purpose, Thomas worried that the new queen viewed the jewels as personal accessories that came with her elevated position. That afternoon, Thomas made an unprecedented decision. He requested a private audience with Sir Clive Alderton, the king's private secretary, and one of the most senior officials in the royal household. Sir Clive had served the royal family for over 15 years and possessed both the authority and the discretion necessary to address Thomas's concerns appropriately. The meeting took place in Sir Clive's elegant office overlooking the palace's main courtyard. Thomas had prepared carefully for this conversation, knowing that he was treading on delicate ground. Criticizing the queen consort's approach, even diplomatically, required extreme care and complete professionalism. Sir Clive, Thomas began after being invited to sit. I've requested this meeting because I have concerns about recent requests regarding the crown jewels collection. As the senior guard responsible for their security and proper handling, I feel obligated to share my professional assessment. Sir Clive leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful and attentive. He had known Thomas for many years and respected his expertise and dedication. Please proceed, Thomas. Your concerns are always taken seriously. Thomas chose his words carefully. Her Majesty Queen Camilla has requested access to several pieces that Queen Elizabeth reserved for only the most significant ceremonial occasions. While I understand the desire to showcase our magnificent collection, I'm concerned about the precedent this might establish and the potential impact on the historical significance of these artifacts. Can you be more specific? Sir Clive asked, his tone neither supportive nor dismissive. Thomas pulled out a folder containing detailed documentation. For example, Queen Alexandra's Kokoshnik tiara has been worn only 12 times since 1936, each occasion marking a moment of exceptional state importance. Queen Elizabeth wore it for her Silver Jubilee celebration and for state visits by heads of state from the Commonwealth's most senior nations. To begin wearing it for regular state dinners would diminish its symbolic weight considerably. Sir Clive nodded slowly, studying the documentation Thomas had provided. I see your point. What about the other pieces mentioned in the request? Queen Mary's diamond bandeau carries particular emotional significance, Thomas continued. Queen Elizabeth spoke often about how wearing it connected her to her grandmother's memory. She reserved it for occasions when she specifically wanted to honor Queen Mary's legacy. Using it as a regular accessory would strip away that meaningful connection. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Thomas providing detailed historical context for each piece in question. Sir Clive listened carefully, occasionally asking probing questions that demonstrated his own deep understanding of royal protocol and tradition. Thomas, Sir Clive finally said, your concerns are well-founded and professionally presented. However, we must also acknowledge that Queen Camilla brings her own perspective to the role. The challenge is finding a way to honor both tradition and evolution. Of course, sir, Thomas replied. My intention isn't to obstruct Her Majesty's wishes but to ensure that any decisions are made with full appreciation of the historical and symbolic implications. Perhaps there might be an opportunity to provide additional context about each piece's significance. Sir Clive considered this suggestion. What would you propose? Why? Thomas had anticipated this question. I would like to request a comprehensive consultation session with Her Majesty, not simply a viewing, but an educational presentation about the historical significance, ceremonial protocols, and cultural meaning of each piece in the collection. Queen Elizabeth often said that understanding the stories behind the jewels was essential to wearing them appropriately. That's an interesting proposal, Sir Clive mused. It would need to be positioned carefully. Queen Camilla is intelligent and knowledgeable, but she might interpret such a session as questioning her judgment or competence. Thomas nodded gravely. I understand the sensitivity, sir. Perhaps it could be framed as a traditional briefing that all new monarchs receive, a sort of comprehensive orientation to the collection's historical and ceremonial significance. Let me consider this, Sir Clive said. I'll need to discuss it with His Majesty and determine the most appropriate way to proceed. In the meantime, I'd like you to prepare a detailed presentation that covers not just the historical facts, but the deeper cultural and symbolic meanings of the most significant pieces. As Thomas left Sir Clive's office, he felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. He had taken a significant professional risk by raising these concerns, but he believed deeply that the integrity of the Crown Jewels collection was worth that risk. The challenge now would be preparing a presentation that could educate without seeming to criticize, inform without appearing to lecture. Over the following days, Thomas threw himself into research and preparation with unprecedented intensity. He contacted historians, reviewed archival documents, and consulted with other long-serving palace staff members who had worked closely with Queen Elizabeth. His goal was to create a comprehensive understanding of how each piece had gained its ceremonial significance through specific historical moments and royal precedent. The work was emotionally challenging for Thomas. Each piece he researched brought back memories of conversations with Queen Elizabeth, moments when she had shared personal anecdotes or historical insights that weren't recorded in any official documentation. He realized that much of what he knew about the collection's deeper significance had been passed down through oral tradition, from one custodian to the next, rather than formal written records. One evening, as Thomas worked late in his office surrounded by historical documents and photographs, he received an unexpected visitor. Lady Sarah Pemberton, who had served as one of Queen Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting for over 20 years, knocked softly on his door. "Thomas," she said as she entered, "I heard about your concerns regarding the crown jewels. I wanted you to know that you're not alone in worrying about how they'll be treated going forward." Lady Sarah's support came as both a relief and an additional responsibility for Thomas. If other long-serving members of the royal household shared his concerns, it confirmed that the issue was significant enough to warrant action, but it also increased the pressure to handle the situation with exceptional care and wisdom. "Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth trusted you with those treasures for good reason," Lady Sarah continued. "She knew that you understood their true value went far beyond their monetary worth. I hope you'll find a way to share that understanding with Queen Camilla." As Lady Sarah departed, Thomas returned to his research with renewed determination. He understood now that he wasn't simply protecting physical objects but preserving the institutional memory and cultural significance that gave the monarchy its deeper meaning. The crown jewels weren't just symbols of royal authority. They were tangible connections to centuries of British history, embodying the continuity and permanence that made the monarchy relevant in the modern world. The presentation he was preparing would need to accomplish something unprecedented, educating a reigning queen about the deeper significance of her own crown jewels, without seeming to question her authority or judgment. Thomas knew that the success or failure of this endeavor could determine not just how these precious artifacts would be treated but how the monarchy itself would honor its historical foundations, while adapting to contemporary expectations. Late into the night, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom and tradition of centuries, Thomas Hartwell continued his meticulous work, understanding that the preservation of Britain's royal heritage now rested largely in his careful hands. 2 weeks later, Thomas Hartwell stood in the state drawing room, making final adjustments to an elaborate presentation he had spent countless hours preparing. Easels displayed carefully researched timelines and historical photographs, while a long mahogany table held detailed documentation and replica pieces that could be handled safely during the discussion. He had transformed the elegant room into a comprehensive educational environment that would allow Queen Camilla to understand the crown jewels not just as beautiful objects, but as living pieces of history. Sir Clive had managed the delicate diplomatic challenge of arranging this session beautifully. Rather than presenting it as correction or criticism, he had positioned it as a traditional comprehensive briefing that previous monarchs had received, emphasizing Thomas's unique expertise and institutional knowledge. The session had been scheduled for a full afternoon, allowing time for detailed exploration of the collection's most significant pieces. Thomas checked his pocket watch nervously. Queen Camilla was due to arrive in 10 minutes, accompanied by Lady Sarah Pemberton, who had volunteered to attend as a bridge between the old and new approaches to royal tradition. The presence of someone who had served Queen Elizabeth so closely would provide additional credibility to the historical accounts Thomas planned to share. When Queen Camilla entered the room, Thomas was struck by her demeanor. She appeared genuinely interested and engaged, her earlier casual attitude replaced by something approaching scholarly curiosity. Perhaps Sir Clive's diplomatic explanation of the session's purpose had successfully conveyed its educational rather than corrective intent. "Mr. Hartwell," Queen Camilla said warmly, "Sir Clive tells me you've prepared a comprehensive exploration of our crown jewels collection. I must admit, I'm looking forward to learning more about the stories behind these magnificent pieces. Thomas bowed respectfully. Your Majesty, it is my honor to share what I've learned during my years of service. Queen Elizabeth often spoke about how understanding the history behind each piece enhanced their meaning when worn. Please, proceed, Queen Camilla said, settling into a comfortable chair positioned to view both the visual displays and the documentation Thomas had prepared. Thomas began with the oldest pieces in the collection, starting with Street Edward's crown and its connection to the coronation ceremonies, stretching back over 1,000 years. He explained how the crown's design incorporated symbols representing different aspects of royal authority and divine blessing, making it far more than ceremonial headwear. The arches of the crown represent the dome of heaven, Thomas explained, pointing to detailed photographs. Queen Elizabeth always said that wearing it reminded her that royal authority comes with divine responsibility. She found the weight of the crown, both physical and symbolic, to be a source of humility rather than pride. Queen Camilla leaned forward, studying the images with obvious interest. I hadn't realized the theological significance was so carefully embedded in the design. The symbolism is quite profound. Encouraged by her response, Thomas moved to the imperial state crown, sharing stories about specific diamonds and their journeys through history. He told her about the Black Prince's ruby, which had been worn into battle at Agincourt, and the Street Edward's sapphire, which connected the crown to Anglo-Saxon monarchy, predating the Norman conquest. Each stone carries its own narrative, Thomas continued. Queen Elizabeth knew all these stories by heart. She said that wearing the crown meant carrying the weight of all that history and honoring those who had worn it before her. Lady Sarah spoke up for the first time. I remember Her Majesty telling me that she could feel the presence of previous monarchs when she wore certain pieces. It wasn't superstition, but a profound sense of connection to the unbroken chain of royal service. Thomas nodded gratefully. That's exactly the perspective Queen Elizabeth brought to the collection. She saw herself not as owner but as temporary custodian, responsible for preserving both the physical artifacts and their deeper meaning for future generations. As the session continued, Thomas watched Queen Camilla's expression change gradually from polite interest to genuine engagement. When he showed her Queen Mary's fringed tiara and explained its connection to royal weddings spanning multiple generations, she asked thoughtful questions about how traditions evolved while maintaining their essential significance. I'm beginning to understand, Queen Camilla said slowly. These pieces aren't just jewelry that happens to be old and valuable. They're physical embodiments of institutional memory and cultural continuity. Precisely, Your Majesty, Thomas replied, feeling a surge of hope. Queen Elizabeth often compared them to religious artifacts. Their power comes not from their material value, but from their role in connecting past, present, and future. The afternoon's most crucial moment came when Thomas addressed Queen Alexandra's Kokoshnik tiara, one of the pieces Queen Camilla had specifically requested for regular state functions. Thomas had prepared this discussion with particular care, knowing it represented the heart of his concerns. This tiara has a unique place in the collection, Thomas began, displaying photographs of its rare appearances over the decades. Queen Elizabeth wore it only 12 times in 70 years, each occasion marking a moment of exceptional historical significance. She said that its rarity made it more powerful, not less useful. Queen Camilla studied the photographs thoughtfully. You're suggesting that frequent wear would diminish rather than enhance its impact? In Queen Elizabeth's view, yes, Thomas replied carefully. She believed that certain pieces gained their power through restraint. When she wore this tiara, everyone present understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. It commanded attention precisely because it appeared so rarely. Lady Sarah added her perspective. I was present when Her Majesty wore it for the Silver Jubilee celebration. The reaction in the room was palpable. People understood they were seeing not just a beautiful tiara, but a symbol of the monarchy's most solemn moments. Thomas could see Queen Camilla processing this concept. So the strategy isn't to hide these pieces away but to use them strategically, when their appearance will have maximum symbolic impact. Exactly, Your Majesty, Thomas confirmed. Queen Elizabeth developed what she called a hierarchy of occasions. Different pieces were appropriate for different levels of state importance. This tiara was reserved for moments when the crown needed to project its deepest historical authority. The discussion continued for nearly 4 hours, covering dozens of pieces and their specific ceremonial roles. Thomas shared stories he had never told anyone else, anecdotes Queen Elizabeth had confided during their private consultations about the collection. He explained the subtle differences between pieces appropriate for Commonwealth occasions versus European state visits, the significance of wearing inherited pieces versus acquired ones, and the careful balance between honoring tradition and acknowledging contemporary relevance. Perhaps most importantly, Thomas helped Queen Camilla understand the concept of earning the right to wear certain pieces through the gravity of specific occasions. Queen Elizabeth had never worn her most significant jewelry casually. Each appearance had been carefully considered and justified by the historical importance of the moment. As the session drew toward its conclusion, Queen Camilla sat quietly for several minutes, absorbing everything she had learned. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a thoughtfulness that hadn't been present during her initial viewing of the collection. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, "I owe you an apology. When I first saw these pieces, I was overwhelmed by their beauty and eager to honor them through use. I didn't fully appreciate that their greatest honor might come through careful restraint and strategic deployment." Thomas felt a profound sense of relief washing over him. "Your Majesty, there's no apology necessary. These perspectives take time to develop. Queen Elizabeth herself evolved her understanding over decades of service, but I should have asked more questions initially," Queen Camilla continued. "I should have sought to understand the deeper traditions before making decisions about how to proceed." Lady Sarah leaned forward. "Your Majesty, the fact that you've taken this time to learn demonstrates exactly the kind of thoughtful approach that the collection deserves. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth would be pleased to know you're taking such care with these treasures." Queen Camilla stood and walked to the window, looking out at the palace grounds where Queen Elizabeth had spent so many years contemplating the weight of royal responsibility. "I want to do this correctly," she said quietly. "Not just wear these beautiful pieces, but earn the right to represent what they symbolize." Thomas approached respectfully. "Your Majesty, might I suggest that we develop a comprehensive protocol for the collection, something that honors both tradition and your own perspective on how these pieces can best serve the modern monarchy?" "Yes," Queen Camilla replied decisively. "I want you to help me understand not just what Queen Elizabeth did, but why she made the choices she made. I want to learn how to read the symbolic language these pieces speak." Over the following weeks, Thomas found himself in an unprecedented position. Instead of simply maintaining and guarding the crown jewels, he became Queen Camilla's primary advisor on their ceremonial use. Together, they developed guidelines that respected historical precedent while allowing for thoughtful evolution in response to contemporary needs. Queen Camilla proved to be an eager student, asking detailed questions about protocol and symbolism. She began reading historical accounts of previous monarchs and their relationships with the collection. Most importantly, she started approaching each decision about jewelry with careful consideration of what message different pieces would convey. The transformation was remarkable. When Queen Camilla wore Queen Mary's diamond bandeau for her first Commonwealth Day service, she did so with full understanding of its connection to imperial history and its significance within the collection's hierarchy. Her choice demonstrated both respect for tradition and thoughtful adaptation to contemporary circumstances. Thomas realized that his fears about Queen Camilla's casual approach had been largely unfounded. What he had initially interpreted as disrespect was actually eagerness combined with incomplete information. Once she understood the deeper significance of the pieces, she embraced their symbolic weight with appropriate gravity. 6 months later, as Thomas conducted his evening security rounds through the crown jewels vault, he reflected on how the situation had resolved. Queen Camilla had not only learned to appreciate the collection's historical significance but had brought her own thoughtful perspective to their use. She had found ways to honor Queen Elizabeth's approach while making the pieces relevant for a new era. The late Queen's treasured jewels remained secure, both physically and symbolically. They continued to serve their essential function as tangible links between the monarchy's historical foundations and its contemporary role. Thomas had successfully fulfilled his deeper responsibility as their custodian, ensuring that their meaning would be preserved along with their magnificent beauty. Most importantly, Queen Camilla had demonstrated that respecting tradition didn't mean rigid adherence to the past, but rather thoughtful understanding of why certain practices had developed and how they could continue serving the monarchy's essential purposes. She had learned to see the crown jewels as Queen Elizabeth had seen them, not as personal accessories, but as sacred trusts, held temporarily in service to something greater than any individual monarch. As Thomas locked the vault for the night, he felt a profound sense of completion. The crown jewels would continue to tell their ancient stories while adapting to new chapters in the monarchy's ongoing narrative. Queen Elizabeth's legacy of thoughtful custodianship would continue, carried forward by someone who had learned to appreciate their true significance. The treasures were safe, their meaning preserved, their future secure in hands that had learned to hold them with appropriate reverence and wisdom.